Vicky, we good? Screen's working? Okay, if you say so. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, give me a second to look around. I'm going to call them out because are we live? Yeah, we're live. Bill and Pam Ragland are here. Bill is an elder that I had in Charleston, South Carolina for 7 years. Or I guess 1 month short of 7 years. So they came in town yesterday, I believe. We had lunch yesterday, had a good time. Showed in Camp Canaan. Speaking of which, remember last year I've been here for a whole 30 days before I cold called people I'd never met and asked them to help me with Camp Canaan. If you're available the first week in June, we need you.
I'll be there.
All right. 2 people, all right. Okay, well, Lindsay, you're going to be there. I mean,
Lord will it.
the creek don't rise, as Grandma used to say.
I have to take back I'm sorry, I can't be there.
Well, who's going to be our nurse?
I don't know.
Who's going to look at the ingredients of all the things I eat and tell me if it's good or not?
Well, nobody's going to do that like me.
That's got that right.
Because there are other nurses that might sit out there in the shade.
All right, buddy.
I'm good for nurse.
Mona's going to be the target for this morning's class.
Go for it. Better hurry than me.
I volunteer.
Okay, all right. We are in Hosea.
We're in.
Hosea. Yeah, Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. Y'all ready? Just 60 chapters. Let's roll. Yeah, Isaiah, I've never taught publicly. Can you imagine why? We'd be here for a couple years talking about Isaiah. Never taught Ezekiel long format. Never taught Jeremiah long format. I taught Daniel's the first half because the second half is a bit tricky. All right. So Hosea, we're in chapter 2. Is that correct? All right. What verse? No. That's a good answer. 10? Okay, sounds about right. So we look in this particular book, who is the king in the north? Y'all remember? Same king in Jonah, same king in Amos. Jeroboam, 1, 2, or 3? 2. There we go. Y'all know something, don't you? All right. Sure, it's definitely my brilliant instruction that's helped you along this study. Never read it before, I'm sure. Hosea chapter 10, you have a situation in which God is trying to paint a picture for Israel. Things are going quite well, as you might remember from our study in Jonah and Amos in the beginning of Hosea. Things are great in the nation of Israel for a little while, and the people are complacent. They have multiple idols in which they're worshiping alongside of Jehovah. That kind of goes against one of those 10 commandments, right? Might be that first or second one. So it seems pretty important that the prophets that are sent are represented well by the people that are listening to them, and so far things are not being received, right? They're not responding to the message of the prophets here. And so there's an empire coming. Which empire is coming? Assyria. Assyria is coming. They're going to take the high people, the people of renown, the people that are wealthiest, have the most influence and power in Israel, especially the north, going to strip them naked, as talked about previously in chapter 2, and put fish hooks through their cheeks and drag them along to show the people what's going on. So not a great message, and yet it's important for the people to respond to it, which they're not going to do. But verse 10, I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. So this is one of those negative messages, obviously. Drawing that parallel between a lot of things are going on here when it comes to a metaphor or an illustration. You've got the people of Israel talked about as being the bride or the wife of Israel's God, which is Jehovah God, Yahweh. And then you've got the metaphor taking place here in which you find the prophet Hosea and his wife, who is named Gomer, right? So she was either was or currently is someone who's involved in prostitution. So she has many lovers who are providing for her, and she thinks everything's okay. And then she eventually wants to go back to where she was protected with Hosea. And so you have a lot of this kind of going back and forth between the illustration of Israel and Yahweh, and then you've got Hosea and Gomer as the illustration. Verse 11, I will put an end to all her mirth. What's mirth? Happiness, joy, celebration, smiles, right? Her feast and her new moons, her Sabbath, and all her appointed feasts. So one thing to mention here, this is language that's important to know what we're talking about because it's used elsewhere, and most importantly for us in the New Testament as well by Paul, in reference to people that still have these as a part of their yearly life. So real quick, the feasts, new moons, Sabbath, and appointed feasts, what's that talking about? Okay, there we go. Religious festivals, right? Including what? Passover is a big one, right? Festival of booths or of tents, right? An annual celebration to live in a tent, essentially, to remind them where they came from, right? That origin story seems to be very significant for the history of Israel, and they were to do that perpetually to remember where they came from. And we talked about that in Amos a lot, the idea that Amos is always going back to Egypt. When they were in Egypt, God rescued them, and because of that, they were bought, they were redeemed, if you will. And because of that origin, they should be reminded of their humility before God because he's the one that did the saving. It wasn't Moses. I mean, he was the instrument in which God worked his miracle of giving them that freedom from Egypt eventually. But the idea is remembering that origin, that God was the one doing it, should keep them kind of in the right mindset or framework in which to remember God. And they were forgetting God was the issue. The reason why I want to kind of harp on that a little bit is because you have Paul talking about people that were still observing these religious festivals or holidays on their calendar after they were converted from Judaism to Christianity. Is that a wrong thing to do? To still remember the Passover, still remember the Tent of Booths and so on, Festival of Booths? No, please say confidently, right? No, it wasn't, but some people were making a big deal about it, like you have to remember the Passover, you have to celebrate these Jewish festivals or holy days to be a good Christian. Paul's saying that's not the way that works. Nor is circumcision the way to go if you're someone who is Gentile in origin and become a Christian. You don't have to first go through Judaism to become a Christian, which is good for us because many of us come from the background of being someone who's considered a Gentile or non-Jewish. However, was it wrong for someone who was Jewish in their heritage to celebrate those festivals, religious holidays? No, it wasn't. And people were being judged either because they were doing it or weren't doing it. And Paul was saying, it doesn't really matter. If you want to do it, that's your freedom, your ability, your prerogative, right? So, what's that? Somewhere.
If you're away from it, I understand.
This is what we do.
Yeah, it would seem more from Paul's perspective, it would appear that if that's your cultural thing, if you grew up Jewish, I mean, you have holidays that are built into your system of family. Despite the religious overtones of them, they were a family gathering. And it was not sinful, therefore, to observe those for your own family for that cultural benefit. However, if you were putting that line in the sand saying you must do this to be a good Christian, that's where Paul had an issue. There are some lessons to be learned from that, I think. Do we have in our culture things that are maybe considered somewhat religious but more have an overtone of family gatherings that we observe? You got a green tree in your house in December, don't you? Well, I do anyway. If you don't, that's okay. How dare you? Keep Christ in Christmas. Haven't you seen the bumper stickers everywhere? No, I pick on that a little bit because we have some groups within our own number that have a huge problem with people observing Christmas around Christmas time. And people also have a huge problem sometimes with hiding plastic eggs that have candy in them around a church property. Is it our right to do that? Yeah. Do you have to do it to go to heaven? No. No. There's no book, chapter, and verse for Christmas. Really, there's no book, chapter, and verse for Easter. I mean, it's technically in the King James Version. No, it's the translation problem of the King James. Believe it or not, they do exist. However, when it comes to what we do as a family unit, it's our prerogative. All right, enough of that. Verse 12, and I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beast of the field shall devour them. So what's going on in verse 12? This is a huge moment to kind of get, if you don't get anything else from this chapter. What's happening in verse 12?
It seems they had large egos in verse 12 and were, saying they did this, they deserve that.
Right, so they were...
So God's going to take that away.
Yeah, so they were taking the benefit, the blessings that God was giving them from the land, the fig trees that were already planted, the vineyards already there, already established, and they were reporting them to be the benefit of these other deities in the Canaanite land. God says, okay, I'll show you who's really responsible for all this. I'll take those things that you love so much, you're giving me glory and honor and respect for, and I'm going to take them away, and the animals are going to eat them. It's going to be a forest. It's not going to be a vineyard anymore. Verse 13, I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burned offerings to them and adorned herself with ring and jewelry and went after her lovers and forgot me, declares the Lord. It really is, when you think about this relationship between Israel and Yahweh and Hosea and Gomer, and even extending that metaphor into how it's used by Paul and Peter and others about the idea of the bride's groom being Christ and the church being the bride. Especially when you get towards Revelation, that's kind of talked about a whole lot at the beginning of that relationship, because it extends over not just from God to the church universal, so kind of an umbrella term there, but even individual, looking into different locations in modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, and looking at those congregations of the Lord's church, the Lord's body, being described in that way. It's interesting the way God has talked about it, because it's really clearer to us in an example when you've got this little nation, Israel, and their relationship with our God, with the Creator God, and then it extends to now there are multiple little hot spots of where His people are across the world, not just one little nation in the middle of the Middle East. So He's not quite thrilled about verse 13 and them offering things to Baal, or Baal, however you want to pronounce it. They forgot God. One sermon that I do occasionally is the idea of how forgetful we are as people, just as humanity. We forget things, right? If we don't take the time, at least annually, to remember something significant for our nation's history, personal history, religious history, then we tend to forget, and has less of an impact on our lives. So we are forgetful people, and God knows that. Okay, questions, comments? Okay, verse 14. If you have a Bible that kind of subdivides the chapters into sections, this is a new section. We're transitioning from here's the bad news and here's why to something else. Verse 14, therefore, behold, I will allure her. What's that mean? Seduce, yeah. Tempt, draw. You know, you have the image in Proverbs, for example, of the adulterous woman A woman who's married, her husband's away on a trip, she says, and trying to allure people into her bedroom. That kind of gives you an idea of maybe what Solomon had experienced. Surely he had some experience. Verse 14, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. So what's the emotion here?
Us, them, back.
Yeah, he's going to try to woo them back. I love that word, woo.
Thank you, I'm old.
Well, I used that word too back in the day, trying to woo people. Didn't work that well, except for somebody who got stuck with me. Verse 15, there I will give her vineyards and make the valley of Acre a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. Again, that origin story. I'm going to bring them back, speak tenderly to them, forgive them of their wrongdoing, and be their God again. Verse 16, and in that day, which by the way, whenever you see that phrase, especially in the minor prophets or major prophets, in that day seems to be a very significant moment because especially in Joel, we'll get there in a little bit, that day could mean something more significant than just that day. We talked about it a little bit towards the end of Amos. What does in that day kind of translate to? George kept saying it over and over again in Amos. Not really a day per se, but in that time period. And that's significant to us really only because Peter makes a really strong connection in our favorite chapter, which is Acts chapter 2, right? That's our go-to chapter, isn't it? It's mine anyway, because it's pretty simple to see what happens there when the keys are used by Peter and opens the door of heaven, if you will, or of the kingdom. In that day, Joel talked about, and Peter was saying, this is that day. This is that time frame that he was writing about. So here we go. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. You ever call your spouse by the wrong name and want to admit it publicly while we're being broadcast across the internet? By the wrong name. Maybe, I don't know, it's a good thing or not. Okay, it's a thing. Yeah, it's not usually a positive association, right? If I were to just mess up the name of my spouse to her, it's going to be a problem. We're going to have a bad day, it's just guaranteed. And that's what they were doing here, is they were saying that Yahweh is the same as Baal, who didn't do a thing for him because Baal is not real. For, or because, verse 17, I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beast of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things on the ground. Interesting how God always refers to the animal kingdom in the same way, using these three illustrations, right? And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety, and I will betroth you to me, or marry you to me, forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know Yahweh, or the Lord, or Jehovah. Let's pause here. What day are we talking about here in this particular context? Or what time period do you think? Isn't that a good answer? Safe? Can't pick on that. There's two options, really. So option one is Ezra and Nehemiah, which if you've not read, that's when they are in captivity for 70 years. Their favorite prophets were saying it's going to be 7 years, y'all. It's going to be okay. We'll go back home. Things going to be okay. And then you had, of course, the Debbie Downer prophets who actually spoke from God's word, and they said, no, it's not going to be 7, it's going to be 70. Y'all are going to die out here. You're not going back home. Your kids and grandkids will go back home, but not you. And so when they go back from captivity to Israel, and they're given the money to really rebuild Jerusalem, and the walls and the temple is restored, That's a pretty good time period. Then you've got the Malachi. We'll talk about him towards the end, obviously. And he talks about, okay, this is good. Things are going in the right direction, but the emphasis is not really on Jerusalem. It's going to be significant for a particular reason, but not the reason you're thinking. There's someone coming. And before he gets here, there's going to be a forerunner to prepare the way for the Lord. And then he comes in Matthew chapter 1. Mark chapter 1, Luke chapter 1, John goes back, and then he goes forward in John chapter 1. So that's one thought is, yeah, he's going to restore that nation of Israel when they come back from captivity, but it doesn't quite fit everything perfectly because there are still a lot of issues in Israel, even past Ezra and Nehemiah. When you get to the Maccabees, for example, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, talk about the revolutions that were trying to take place, trying to kick them out and prepare the way for the Lord their own way through combat and through warfare and through all this kind of stuff. So what's the big picture? What's the full revelation of when that covenant is restored between God and his people?
When Christ comes and the church is established as the bride.
Right, so we have the New Testament, new covenant that's begun here. Verse 18, I will make for them a covenant, agreement, relationship with all the people that are present. So even all the animal kingdom is going to be aware of the church and that new covenant. So that's how the prophets usually work, right? You've got more than one thing in mind or in scope, and you can kind of see where one would fit and one fits better, and maybe even looking forward until Judgment Day when that's the true revelation of God and Jesus in that covenant relationship. So you can kind of see some multiple things in scope here as opposed to just one thing, which is how prophets kind of work. Okay, questions, comments about that particular section? Sir?
All right, I'll make a comment back on verse 14.
Yeah.
You passed over briefly, which maybe is significant. Israel is unfaithful.
Yep.
And God says, I'm going to allure you and bring you into the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And we think of the wilderness as some place to avoid. Nobody wants to go in the wilderness, but the wilderness is always where God meets with people.
Yeah.
Moses, Elijah, the Israelites, Jesus.
Yep.
And sometimes God's got to take us into a wilderness.
A wilderness,
To
yes.
just to listen to Him.
Yeah, so the wilderness here has a little bit of overtone to it, to the idea of being a barren land, an unsafe land. But when God's with you, that's the whole point, is He's there to protect you. Sometimes in the New Testament, in some translations, you might have the idea of the desert. I'm thinking of him going away into the desert to be tempted by Satan for 40 days, 40 nights with fasting. And that word desert may not be the best translation for that word. It's more like some newer translations have the word deserted place. And that's the same idea behind a wilderness. It's some place that's not a city, not protected by people, not protected by the army. You're just there with the Lord. And that's, of course, a significant place of where you can meet Him. A kind of a sermon-y kind of thing that you might want to think about when that comes up is that do you sometimes go to the wilderness in your own life? And what I mean by that is, do you ever feel like you're in the middle of nowhere and you're all by yourself and you're unsafe? Sometimes some things force us to go into those areas that are barren, that are deserted, that we don't want to be, because it's not safe for us. But when the Lord's with us in that place, everything's going to be okay. It's also a place of humility, because you feel secure and you feel safe and you feel protected when you're in the top of a mountain and you have a fortress around you and you feel safe. And then when the army comes and you're in your safe place and it's not safe for much longer, then you feel like, where has God been? Well, God's been waiting to meet you in the middle of nowhere where you were humble in your own vision. So yeah, there's a lot there for that. Okay, anything else? Okay, verse 21, and in that day, there we go, I will answer, declares the Lord, I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy, and I will say I say to not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. So what's happening there, if you recall?
Hosea's
So he's picking on his kids from the pulpit, which every good preacher has done. Right? He's talking about the children he had with Gomer, who are named pretty tragic names if you were that child. And he's saying, I'm going to answer them. I'm going to return that right relationship. Again, in that day, you kind of got multiple scopes. Yes, there's going to be some redemption for them when they come out of captivity in Ezra and Nehemiah, and you have the fullness of that kind of revealed in a way through Christ, and then ultimately towards the end of time, if you want to look that far into the future, that's going to be the ultimate culmination. Okay, so that's all the parallel. Chapter 3, so-called, in verse 1, I say that every time. Let me cough into the mic. Okay, I say it every time because the chapters and verses were not there originally, just one long text. And so we have chapters to help us delineate different sections and just to kind of break it up, make it more convenient, which was added way later than you might think historically. Okay, chapter 3, verse 1. And the Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, which is not a great thing for him to do. Even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins, which, if you don't know, seems like a weird thing to say, right? So towards the end, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. What's it all about? Okay, if you're worshiping pagan gods, they need stuff, apparently, that nobody eats. So they take raisins. Raisins are just what? Dried grapes. All right, that's good. We're on the same page there. So you're taking the product from the vineyards that they didn't plant, though they're reaping from them, and then they're offering that to their Baal and other gods in the land, Ashtoreth, no doubt. Verse 2, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and an homer and a lekteth of barley, which ain't that much. Just put that out there for you. So I bought her and said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man, so I will also be to you. Some of that language, obviously, is a little bit hard to talk about on a Sunday morning during worship. Can you imagine why? Mommy and Daddy, what does that mean? Well, talk about it on the way home. Sorry, y'all. Verse 4, because the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar. So you have that parallelism that kind of explains one thing by the other. Without ephod or household gods. So let's kind of just pause. So God is telling Hosea to go and redeem, literally buy back his wife from prostitution. Which, put yourself in his sandals for a little bit. He may or may not have wanted to do that. But the illustration, the metaphor still continues. So go buy her back. You guys restore your relationship in a way by setting those boundaries of the covenant, which is a kind of technical way to say it, but that's kind of what it is. And he's using that as an illustration of what's going to be happening with Israel in the future, right? Verse 4, the reason why he's making that establishment of the covenant is to confirm what he knows is going to be the case. Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince. Well, why would that be? They're in captivity, right? They don't have a leadership structure because they've all been killed or destroyed or taken captive or thrown in prison or whatever, which they were. Without sacrifice or pillar. Why? Well, for the north, because they didn't have the temple in their land, right? You had Bethel and you had Dan, but those two locations weren't really the places to worship God, but they were used for that purpose. And then for the south, eventually from Babylonian captivity, they wouldn't have a temple anymore. It would be destroyed. It's hard for Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the temple. The temple's not hurt, so it was. without ephod, which was just a priestly garment, right, kind of a chest plate, in which they had many stones, 12 stones for all the tribes of Israel and so on, or household gods. So you couldn't even go to your home and worship your own personal deity because you don't have a home anymore. Verse 5, afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek Yahweh their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. Now, that phrase, again, latter days, talks about a very specific time. And especially in Acts chapter 2, Peter is revealed to show that Joel talked about the latter days, and he said, those latter days are now. So we're not looking into the future, we're looking at the idea of the first century and then kind of forward in that day, in that time period. Questions, comments? All right, let's pan back a little bit. Let's pan back. It's helpful for me to step back from the text sometimes and just remind myself why this is important. Because it's easy for someone to show up and hear all this. If it's your first time hearing it, and you're like, what? Who cares? Why is it so significant? Why is it so important? We learn about this stuff if we don't live under this law. If we're not Jews, what's the point? So somebody tell me the point of all this. Why should we care about this? Okay, you're getting to know more about God. God has had relationships with people on earth before Christ came into the world. So you see how he feels and how he thinks and how he responds to his people when certain things are done. It's one very good reason. What else?
Our country's going through right now. We're turning further and further away from God, and God is going to punish us just like he punished all these guys. We need to look at it, pay attention to it, and do something about it.
Okay, true. It's not my favorite answer. I know it is. And that's a personal thing for me, because I just know so many preachers who feel like they need to stand in the gap when it comes to this politically. And I've known so many preachers that bring a newspaper to the pulpit with them and preach right from that. That bothers me to a level that you'll never understand, maybe. So yes, but overall, big picture, yes. You look at a nation and how it's thinking about God, the true God, and you've got some things that you can read in and learn from there. That's true. Mary?
What is God's relationship with his creation? And that relationship is in layers. Because he has a different relationship with my dog than he has with me.
I hope.
Yes, and he also has different relationships with nations, individual nations, and then he has a relationship with the whole world. So Christianity is available to all of humankind. Doesn't matter what nation they're from. And I don't know how else to say it.
Okay.
It's not just our nation, it's all nations, and all nations are going through the same phases. But some of our nations are going faster than others.
That is a very true thing. It's also very hard to gauge, right? It's hard to gauge that. Which direction we're headed, how fast, what God's timeline is for all that. It's impossible to know without His revelation. But yeah, so, Lisa?
The way I see it is, as bad as the Israelites were, his children, he always had compassion for them, which is what we need to grasp for us today. No matter what nation we're in, no matter what, if you're a Christian, you have access to that grace.
Right. It's true. George?
Well, they're all relevant because I'm pointing to an event that's important to us, and that is the coming of the ultimate king. All of these prophets, while they were aiming at a short-term target, were also aiming at a long-term target, and that is the fulfillment of all these promises.
Right. So that's why I wanted to kind of step back for a second and just kind of remind us, because we can get lost in the weeds here, and by we I mean me, and to kind of forget the reason why it's so important. I talked about at the beginning of this particular set of lessons from the Minor Prophets about why it was important, and keeping that in mind is very significant. So knowing more about it is key. We'll do one more verse and then we'll pause for the morning. Let's see, verse 1 of chapter 4. Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. He's got a bone to pick, we would say. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. So you have this kind of poetic almost reflection on how even the land is mourning the actions of the people of Israel, because they're just like all the other nations. And their entire intent and purpose behind the law and being given it was to make them distinct and separate among all the other nations. So having a people that are connected to God but being like everybody else has always been a problem. That's significant for us for multiple reasons, but one of the most obvious ones is when we are called in a relationship with God, there are certain restrictions on our behavior, on our mindsets, talked about in the New Testament, that should make us distinct. Peculiar people, we're called. So we're to be someone different than everybody else around us, just based on our connection to the divine. So we will pause here for the morning and pick up chapter 4, verse 4, Lord willing, next week. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. And we'll be dismissed now for 18 minutes before worship begins. Thank you.